turn to someone who's working from a point of view of Germany with Africa, I think in many ways with the diaspora as well as also with the German community, to try to also develop more dialogue and cooperation between the African continent and Germany. She's the representative for Africa Deutschland, an NGO, Grace Reinhardt. If you could please make your opening statements.
Yes, thank you so much for the invite. And I'm actually here on behalf of the African Organization for Africa. So we're the German arm of For Africa, but it's actually an African-founded and African implementing organization. So we're currently present in 8 African countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and all our programs are designed and implemented by Africans in the respective countries. And because of visa and other issues, my colleagues couldn't come, so I'm representing them today. But I'm guessing I'm kind of taking the role on this panel as the implementing partners with the boots on the ground, the people who implement the aid that is given. And I guess we're talking about a future of democracy at this forum. And I think we need to practice the basis of democracy in foreign aid as well. So, like our other panelists have said, some of the countries that we deal with and work in, they are more like autocracies and not democracies. And in foreign aid, a lot of the programs and interventions that are planned on the state level, on the bilateral level. While yes, for Africa, we also believe in the bottom-up approach, where you actually involve the communities in designing and creating the programs, because democracy means ruled by people, and that needs to be practiced in aid as well. So we take our local staff and they sit with the communities for hours and they ask them, what do you think the challenges are? What do you think the solutions are? What do you think you can contribute to the solutions if we partner with you? And then we look at the country strategic plans, at the SDGs and at the strategies of the funding partners, and we try to match that. But it needs to align with what the communities actually want to see, the change that they want to see. So, and then we design our programs and then we design our interventions. So at For Africa, we try to practice democracy at the ground level in aid and not just at the state level.
Excellent. Well, thank you much. What I'd like to do now is first take a round of questions and interactions from you, the audience, to see also what are the questions that you're interested in, and then we can maybe come back to the panel for some responses. So it's early in the morning, I know, but I'm sure you all have come here for different reasons, with different interests. Who would like to pose a question or make a comment? Please, and please introduce yourself as well.
I'm based in Germany. I was born in China and grown up in Taiwan, and I'm a writer and journalist. My questions to these first two panelists. Professor has told us that most of the country, especially 9 of them, are in severe under the severe pressure of debt. And but the other gentleman said from the Chinese side, many countries got the loans, and the Chinese government gave you loans without any condition. I don't understand that. And you also said this is a win-win situation. This is the narrative of the Chinese government. Chinese government always say we try to have a policy or a strategy in Africa and to give them aid, and it should be a win-win situation. Is totally different as the Western country. They are aggressive and they just want to get the profit. So what you two gentlemen have different arguments, so I just want to hear from both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Let me try to clarify the debt situation involving China and Africa. I did state and will restate that there are 9 African countries, according to the International Monetary Fund, and this is their most recent assessment as of several months ago, that are in debt distress. That's the highest level of concern of the International Monetary Fund. Then the question becomes, how much Chinese debt is there with those 9 countries. And in some cases, there's virtually no Chinese debt. It depends on the country that we're talking about. With others, like Djibouti, China holds most of the debt. So China is the primary actor in the case of Djibouti. But in the case of some of the other countries, they're not a major player because the debt is held by some other entity, by the World Bank, by bondholders outside of Africa, or conceivably maybe one of the Gulf state countries, someone other than China. So the overall continent-wide impact of China on African debt is that it holds about 12% of all of African external debt today. Those are figures that are pretty much agreed upon by a number of international non-governmental organizations that have looked at this very carefully. 12 to 13%. So that is the key thing to focus on, the global or the continent-wide impact of China's debt in Africa. Now, on conditionality, we may have a little bit of a difference of understanding here. The former minister said that there is no political conditionality. Well, in a sense, that's true. There is, of course, you must recognize Beijing and not Taiwan, but that's fair enough. If a country does not recognize you, then you're not going to provide aid to it. There is some sort of indirect conditionality that I alluded to, that if an African country opposes publicly China on issues like island building in the South China Sea, or their position on Hong Kong, there's going to be a problem between China and that country. And that's why African countries do not publicly comment on those issues unless they support Beijing. And some of them do support Beijing on those issues. There is some economic conditionality to Chinese loans. If a Chinese company or bank makes a loan to an African country, by contract it will be an African, or it will be a Chinese builder, a Chinese construction company that builds that road or that dam or that bridge or whatever it may be. It's written right into the contract, and China is very insistent upon economic conditionality, but not political conditionality.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the question has been pretty much answered to the extent that when you look at, for example, the vision statement on FOCAC, Forum for Cooperation Between China and Africa, it actually reads, it cites equal consultation, enhancing understanding, expanding consensus, strengthening friendship and promoting cooperation. And these are very generic statements that any autocrat can get away with. And you would find that, for example, I haven't seen a Chinese electoral observer mission in Africa throughout my life in politics. I do see electoral observer missions coming bilaterally from many and virtually almost all European countries. So, for example, the European Union delegation in an African country would almost inevitably deploy an electoral observer mission in a country to supervise, monitor, and report back on the authenticity of elections in that particular country, which would then constitute whether those elections have been free or fair or held under conditions amenable to democracy. I've not seen that kind of participation by China to that extent, or where they even issue political reports on an African country's conduct of elections. So inevitably, these electoral observer mission reports are then scaled up as conditions for aid, for support, and they shape the investor's mindset, even at private sector level, from the countries of origin into that African destination in terms of democratic gains and consolidation. So that's essentially what I was talking about, that there is indifference from China on how Africans are governing themselves, while there is an intrinsic and embedded interest from the West, from the United States, on how we are governing ourselves. And more often than not, it is linked to investment and trade attractiveness and parcels that would accompany that thereof.
Please. I think you were first. No, please.
Thank you. My name is Anton Valéry. I come from Cameroon. I'm based here in Berlin. I'm an ICT student. My question is addressed to the madam. I did not understood well when you're talking about 8 hub in Africa. So I want to be specific on the 8 hub and the country which you are working in Africa. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are working in 8 African countries, in Angola, in Mozambique, South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, the Central African Republic, and South Africa. So those are the countries we're currently present, and we're working both in emergency response up until economic empowerment and the things in between, steps in between. So clean water, wash, education, health, food, and up to economic empowerment, where we actually help people build social enterprises at grassroots level. And so we go the whole process with the communities. So we work in rural communities and mostly not in urban situations, mostly in rural communities, and we do the work from start to finish. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Ming Chang from New York, home of the United Nations. My question is that Africa seems to be voting mostly Chinese candidates for a lot of UN appointed organizations. So clearly there is some sort of influence in terms of helping Chinese to get into critical UN roles. Now, can you explain how can we be more fair-minded to appoint candidates to a more qualified candidate to manage some of these UN organizations?
I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question. You're quite right. China has done a pretty good job recently of putting senior people, or putting Chinese nationals into senior positions in the United Nations. They do it in part because of the support they have had in the UN General Assembly, where they can get votes from a variety of countries, particularly countries in the global south, which includes, of course, the 54 countries in Africa. And if they get enough votes for their candidate, they get them elected into positions of power. And as you rightly point out, they've been very successful at it. I won't comment on the qualifications of the candidates that they have put in to these offices, as I don't know these people personally, so I don't know how qualified they are, or they may not be. But the answer is getting support from other members of the General Assembly to back your candidate. And sometimes the United States wins, and sometimes China wins, sometimes other countries win.
Yeah. So I think your question, China is part of the PRF5 in the Security Council, and it is fair that they must have sort of like a fair check at deployments at UN level, because of their being in the PRF5. But the UN architecture, in my own experience, is not just the apex at New York. It also includes UN agencies, and there may be 17, 18 of them. And I see a lot of Chinese influence actually in the UN agencies, not necessarily or essentially at the apex in New York. You find their footprint is quite feasible at UN level, and then maybe it's part of a strategy to eventually consolidate and work their way up to the apex. However, having said that, I think the UN system itself, especially the agencies, are now due for reform to the extent that they become democratic and allow democratic practices which can bring other nationalities to the fore as candidates. And I speak from experience. I was a candidate myself for UN Tourism Secretary General in 2017. And the General Assembly that was supposed to finally elect the Secretary General was actually held in China, in Chengdu. But it was China itself that denied me a general ballot in their own territory, which could have produced a free and fair election and a candidate of choice for that UN agency. And I still have a gripe with China in that respect, that they facilitated the rigging of a UN election on their own soil. So I think charity begins at home. If you want reform at the apex, you must also start it at the building blocks level, which is the UN agencies. Thank you.
I'll just add to the Chinese foreign minister since 2013. He's made 57 trips to Africa, and for comparison's sake, the past U.S. administration, Blinken, correct me if I'm wrong, was 2 or 3 trips he did up to Africa during a 4-year period. So it's not by accident. They're focused on diplomacy along with what their economic interests are, and they are prioritizing it. You know, Africa is the 2nd largest population of people of all the continents in the world, and they're you know, that's like we mentioned, a voting bloc of 50 countries in the UN. In the UN. So they're if you know, if you're one of these African countries and you've got, you know, he's going to show up in your country on a regular basis, it definitely has a certain level of influence that other countries haven't been.
You make a very good point on that, and another way of stating it is that every year since 1991, without exception, the Chinese foreign minister has made his first overseas visit anywhere in the world to an African country. So normally in January of each year since 1991, the Chinese foreign minister is somewhere in Africa. That's a pretty hard record to beat.
Yeah.
But it's a recognition of the fact that while the world wants to view Africa as one country, it is actually a voting bloc of 55 countries. So if I was sitting in my strategy room and I wanted influence at UN level, I would obviously start with that country, which is seen as one, but there's 55 votes at general ballot level. And I think it influences their visit patterns.
I use the term 54 countries because you're including Western Sahara.
I'm including Western Sahara.
One of the disputed countries. So.
I'm including Western Sahara indeed. Please.
Thank you. My name is Pardon, but my name is Pardon. I'm the Secretary General for the African Forum for Cultural Diplomacy, based in England, but also operating in Africa. I think I have 2 questions. The first one directed to you, Ambassador. I think your last point is very relevant into the geopolitics of Africa, because you do recognize that China makes its first visit into Africa every year, yet the US, I could count, maybe the last US president was in Africa was Barack Obama. The current administration, on the first term, Donald Trump has never been to Africa. I do not know when he will be to Africa, looking at the South African issues right now with the G20, where there is now literally a diplomatic deficit in there. So nature does not love a vacuum space. So the US has literally created a vacuum which China is literally filling the whole of Africa. And also the current US aid withdrawal is not even doing it any better. And as a result, whatever that will come to Africa's table, they will be able to grab that. Is it something that the US is talking about, or is something that literally the US is leaving Africa to the Chinese to do whatever they want? So, especially for you in the US, Europe, obviously, thank you for what you're doing in the 9 countries. I do not know whether Europe has got any strategy for Africa vis-a-vis what is happening again from the US perspective, because that also has created a vacuum. I've seen how our Prime Minister Starmer has literally tried to rescue the Ukraine issue by trying to come up with yet another package that was literally trying to serve them. Is Europe looking at something, a package that can look at Africa in the view of trying to help that? And to our president of FFCD, how is Africa going to look at itself in terms of emancipation from donor aid? How is Africa going to come, not necessarily to rely on these USA, Europe, and the like? How is Africa looking at coming up with a solution for itself that will better its own people and also empower its own people without leveraging on the aid? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Martin, and I think those are excellent questions, maybe to frame also some concluding remarks for each of the speakers. So if you could perhaps respond to that as a way of us offering some concluding remarks. In particular, as you were saying, what can African nations do now to better equip to this changing landscape of politics and geopolitics? Maybe we could start with you.
Sure. Now, you make a very valid point that China has given more high-level attention to Africa than has the United States. In fact, President Biden did visit Africa, Angola, and Cape Verde towards the very end of his administration. But that, 4 years into the administration, you make your first trip to Africa, not very impressive. And President Trump did not visit Africa during his first term, and quite frankly, I don't see much indication he's going to visit in his second term. The USAID issue is very much a moving target. It looks very bad at the moment in terms of the future of USAID. As I pointed out in my opening remarks, traditionally in recent years, the United States has provided about $9 billion in almost exclusively grant aid to Africa. That's a very impressive number. That compares with about $1.5 billion of OECD equivalent aid from China, and most of that Chinese aid is the concessionary component of its loans, which is important, and that constitutes aid, but it's 1.5 billion versus 9 billion. Now, what is going to happen in the coming months, the coming years, with USAID money? Frankly, we don't know, but it's clearly going to go down. And that's going to be a real problem for the United States. So the relationship between the new administration and Africa is very much up in the air at the moment. I worry about it constantly. I'm very concerned about where it's headed. The focus that the new administration is trying to make is on foreign direct investment, which I was talking about in my remarks. And that can fill some of the voids of official government aid, but it cannot fill everything. And it depends upon the American private sector to fill that void. And the record for that is not particularly good, I must point out. I think there will be an effort by the Trump administration to encourage the American private sector to get more engaged. It remains to be seen how engaged they're going to get.
Well, we are right in the citadel of European Unionism. So an effective Africa in the future, which can bargain, negotiate, we have to transform itself from this loose coalition of 55 conglomerates or 55 countries into a proper union. The European Union is not strong by accident, it's strong by design, because it is a union that can bargain, that can negotiate, that can trade, that can invest, that can pool its collective resources, not only in ensuring safety in numbers, but in ensuring that it has the critical mass to negotiate with other polities across the globe, like China, like the United States of America, not as individual smaller entities, the Kosovos we were celebrating last night, for example, Moldovas, and so forth. And we have those kind of countries that were created by history in Africa, which are economically unviable by geographical size, by resource endowment, by population, and yet when they are brought together and amalgamated to the other countries, they have strength. So Africa, we have to discover its formula in terms of that architecture in order for it to be taken seriously by the United States and seriously by China. Imagine a country as small as Lesotho, for example, negotiating with the United States. It attracts the kind of derision that we saw from the United States recently, because they can't even locate it on the global map. But if it is integrated and carried in the weight of an African Union proper, it will have and command its pride of place in trade negotiations, in investment, in other areas that are critical for human development. Having said that, Africa must plug illicit financial flows. There's a lot of money flowing out of Africa, which, if it is kept inside the continent through transparent, accountable accounting models and sound business practice, will benefit our people. If you give me a country today, the first thing I will do, before I even look at revenue streams and revenue lines, it would be to plug the leakages, because there's just too much illicit financial flows out of Africa. It's estimated to be something like 80 billion to 100 billion per annum. Now, if you plug that, you keep it in, it can be a very huge saving for the continent that can drive its development. The second aspect is obviously to make sure that we beneficiate our resources. Africa is richly endowed, but it is losing all its resources in raw form, unbeneficiated, no value addition to other industrialized nations. In the process, also exporting jobs. And that's why our people, they flood Europe, they flood China, they flood every part of the world except Africa, because they are following their jobs, which have gone out as raw materials, which have not been value added at home. So if we did that, if we created industries at home, we would generate jobs, would generate value, and our people would never bother you in Europe or any part of the world, because they will be employed. Jobs will be at home, not outside. And finally, I think this issue of improving democratic governance is super critical. There's nothing as disastrous as investing in an opaque state where autocracy reigns. We need democracy, because it is democracy that will ensure that minority rights are protected, individual rights are protected. I think President Clinton mentioned this the other day, that democracy is not government of the people, by the people, for the people only. It is also, by extension, the protection of minority and individual rights. And you only feel the soundness and strength of democracy when you are outside, when you have lost, when you are not inside. That's when you feel that this country is democratic or not democratic. So we need to work and improve on the democratic performance of Africa. Finally, the migration of Africa to the East is not a rejection of the West. It is just pragmatism on where they can get value at any particular time. So we need to find middle ground, and that middle ground is to force us through intellectually tested models like the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy, the African Forum for Cultural Diplomacy, which force Africans to begin to have dialogue as a recourse, first recourse before they go into conflict, so that we continue to be attractive as investment destinations. So the future of Africa, other than interstate diplomacy, also belongs to non-governmental organizations. It belongs to the individual. And we must capacitate our people at that level to be able to talk to each other so that we can be equal and attractive partners for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris?
Yeah, I hear the crowds upon the door, so I will keep it brief. But as we were discussing U.S. presidents visiting Africa, it dawned on me that back in the U.S., we're all very concerned that Elon Musk is now basically running the country, so and he's South African. So in a sense, the current president may or may not be from South Africa. Doesn't quite count, I know, but it's. No, I'll just reiterate what's been said. But Africa is an extremely beautiful, huge country, series of countries, incredibly diverse people, incredibly wonderful people, lots of economic opportunity. Then Africa has more. It can do just absolutely amazing things. And anything the West can do to kind of help and facilitate in a way that's helpful to people on the ground in Africa and communities on the ground is going to be in everyone's interest, for sure.
Chris?
Yes, I just quickly wanted to get back to your question because you did ask about Europe, and I mean, we talked about democracy in Africa, but we also all know that democracy in the Western countries is under duress as well. We've seen it in the US a couple of years ago. We've seen the right-wing parties getting traction in several European countries, and so I guess we do have some issues to deal with on our own continent. We have a war on our continent in Europe. And so yes, I would argue that there has been a lack of attention for Africa in the past few years, for sure. And for example, the German government has reduced its aid funding in the last 3 years consecutively from their government budgets. And we'll see about the next legislation. It's not looking great right now, the projections. So there's definitely a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of uncertainty in the aid sector, on the future of the aid sector. And maybe something that we didn't really get to talk about today, you briefly mentioned it when you started, but maybe that could be a topic for the future, is the role that the diaspora of Africa could play in the future of Africa. Because we haven't really had time to talk about that, but I think that could be a conversation for the future, because I think there's a big chance there to influence the future of Africa, because there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of identification and focus on Africa from that side.
Well, thank you very much, Grace. We do actually need to conclude. We didn't succeed at coming up with solutions or answers to the many big questions that were stated on today's panel, but I do think that we have some new insights, some new perspectives, and I'd be very happy if each of us maybe sees one or two of these issues from a different perspective because of the discussion and the exchange that we had. So in that sense, I'm very grateful to the panelists for the discussion, and we look forward to continuing this both informally and formally throughout the framework of the forum. So if you could please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.